Welcome, everybody, and thanks to the 80 people who have signed up on live stream. It is so nice to see such a packed house. I'm Rose Berger. I work in talent development, and I'm so happy to have my really good friend, Tali, here today. Um, Thank you to Teresa and Melissa for enabling this event. But really, I think today will be very special, and I think everybody here is a testament to interest in the topic. Tali and I have a daughter. I'm sorry, we don't share a daughter. That would be a little bit too scandalous. Talia and I have daughters who share a teacher. They're in class together, and that's how we met. And Tali has just always been an incredible go-getter. Nothing scares her, and I've always asked her, "How do you do it? How do you do it?" And one day she said to me, "I'm actually writing a book." So I'm happy to have Tali here today, and she's going to share a bit of her story. And oh yeah, let's turn on the mic. And we'll have time for questions at the end. And just really enjoy. Tali is amazing. Thank you, Tali.
Thank you. So I just wanted to start. Is this a good volume, by the way? Good? Okay. By thanking you all for giving me this opportunity to speak into such an impressive group of people, men and women. We all have a story to tell, and I don't think mine is so unique, but I really appreciate the opportunity to tell you mine this afternoon. So I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of my background and my training, and then why I'm here, and get into the meat of the talk. And then I'll have time for questions. And you really can ask me anything. I'm not embarrassed. It could be personal, and you can, if you think of it during the talk, jot it down or journalist. So I'll just give you my stats to start off. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania in a modern Jewish Orthodox family with 3 brothers, no sisters, and a stay-at-home mom who was incredible, and a really workaholic, also awesome father. And I eventually made my way to New York City and went to Columbia College undergrad and graduated with a degree in neuroscience. And then I started Cornell Medical School. And after 4 years being there, I made a huge move across the street to start my residency. Also at Cornell and Columbia, there's a joint ENT head and neck surgery residency, which after 5 years of completing it and 11 years on my track, I finally left the city to do a pediatric airway fellowship at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. After I completed that very long journey, I wanted to come back to the New York area, and I moved out to Westchester, heard of it, and I joined a practice there, which really was this amazing combination for me of academic, where we had residents that we were training, but also private practice. And so there was a quality of life that you don't always get in purely academic practices. And I am the mother of 3 daughters, and married to the most perfect man on the face of the planet. I'm totally kidding. He's really great, but he's like really not perfect. But in the book, he's quite a hero. So why are we here? Mostly I wanted to introduce you all to the book that I wrote, because it's really been this insane passion project of mine, probably the biggest of my life, aside from becoming a surgeon, which a long time too. And even though it's a cancer memoir, so at first glance you might think you have to have had breast cancer. So many people are touched by it in some way, but really a lot of the concepts are pretty universal. I touch on loss and body image and relationships and just everything you can think of, because you kind of go through all these stages when you're faced with a major health crisis. And it's funny too, because that was actually one of my main motivations for writing it, because there's just so much out there. And I kept running into these situations that seemed funny and absurd sometimes, like anyone else having this happen to them, because nobody told me about this. And then I thought, I better write this down. And so I wrote it mostly in like vignette styles when an event would happen. So I started writing really as soon as I got diagnosed, when like the first crazy thing happened. And one of them just involves like a parking ticket in New York City. But it was first of all, when you have chemo brain, like you can't retain anything. So if I didn't write it down, I was going to forget it. But it just kind of like evolved that way. And so I really was trying to capture a lot of the experience that I definitely didn't know about in advance, and that I also thought, you know, there's just a commonality, and there's strength in that, and also you can help others in that way. Although at the time it was like just trapped on my computer. And you know, as things went on, there was. I do? Okay. Actually, I'm pretty loud. There were concepts that I'm going to talk about today that are really beyond the book. And that mostly came out because when I first finished, and if I'm sure you've all written a lot of different things, articles, books, whatever, and you feel like I have nothing else to say, like it's all in there. And then there's just like, what else could I possibly talk about? But as time went on and I had more experiences, I just would, you know, again, kind of evolve different thoughts about the subject of the book and beyond. And a lot of times it was driving to work, because on Wednesdays I drive really, really far up the Taconic. And actually, even more so, it was from giving a lot of talks where people would ask these really insightful questions. And then, you know, questions like, how did you get through it? Or how did it change you? And that's really what I ended up incorporating into the talk. So I'm going to start with my story. So I'm going to take you back first to the winter of 2013. I had just started ramping up my practice, and I had a 2 and a 4-year-old, and I was pregnant with my third daughter. I was 8 months pregnant with my third daughter. And this is me literally operating the day before, a little chunkier than I like being, but on the right-hand side. And that's one of my partners. And after work, so this was, I don't remember, like 5:30 at night, I went for like a routine OB checkup, thinking everything was fine, and I was feeling fine, and ended up having really severe preeclampsia, which was crazy. They just didn't believe that I didn't have symptoms, but really my blood pressure was at 190/100, which is not good. And it's kind of like right before you go into Downton Abbey territory where you're having seizures and all that scary stuff. And so anyway, I ended up emergently delivering my youngest daughter, and you know, she was in the NICU, and it was the first, you know, that was kind of like my first foray into being on the other side of it, because I had been very, very lucky. I had 2 sets of grandparents that lived into their 80s and 90s, and I really was always the doctor and not on the patient side. So with my daughter, I wasn't really the patient, but I was the parent of the patient. And thank God she did well. She grew. She didn't, you know, need that much help breathing, and she graduated the NICU at about a month and a half later. And so I went back to work thinking everything was going to be okay. On top of that, in medicine, there's not a lot of room for maternity leave, so I only had 5 weeks that I had scheduled to be off, and then I had to extend it when this whole, you know, emergency happened. So I was really just like getting my sea legs back. And about 4 months later, my father, who is the CEO of a telecom company and who was extremely close with, had word finding difficulties in the middle of a meeting, and he ended up having a brain tumor. So my whole family was really reeling from that, like just not accepting what was happening. And then 2 weeks later, right before his big surgery, I was just watching a movie in my bedroom, and my husband was like downstairs in the office. So I was by myself, and I just kind of brushed my hand against my chest, and there was a huge tumor there. And I know what a tumor feels like. And I mean, it was big. And I really knew I had cancer at that point. But I didn't tell him because he's not a doctor, and I couldn't handle him freaking out. And it was really surreal. One of those moments where you're just not entirely sure if you're awake or asleep. It's late at night. you're hoping if you fall asleep and wake up again, it's not really true, but obviously it was. And so the very next day, I had like a very long OR schedule, but the breast radiologist in my institution was really nice, and he kept the staff, after hours so that I could come. And so by that evening, I had like a full diagnosis before I had told anyone that I even went there, and it wasn't just like breast cancer, it was definitely invasive. So that still could be pretty good, but it wasn't like maybe it is, maybe it isn't, maybe it's, stage 0. And so I knew all of that before I mentioned it to anyone else. And so it was really, I think, one of the things that's a bit unique about my situation was just the confluence of events, and that unfortunately gave me the fodder to write a book, which I had always wanted to write my whole life. This wasn't exactly the reason I wanted to write it, but it gave me a lot to tell. So I'm just going to read one excerpt, and it also gives you, for anyone who may have cracked it open, but if you haven't, it just gives you a little more information. And then I'll get into some of the other things, like, the tools that I used during the struggle. Okay, so this is on, I'm not reading the whole entire thing, but this is on page 41. So it's called, I Thought I Had the Good Cancer, which always reminds me of that Seinfeld. Does anyone know, with the good lymphoma, the Hodgkin's? Yeah, anyway, seemed funnier to me. So the nutty thing about my father having been recently diagnosed with an incurable type of cancer was that everyone kept referring to me as having the good cancer. Friends of the family used this catchphrase to reassure my mother that things just weren't as bad as they seemed. Well, at least you don't have to worry about Tali too much. Her cancer is easily treatable. Other things that also detracted from my due sympathy. Our family and friends were amazed at my father's hasty recovery from brain surgery. Mine, in contrast, was perceived as oddly sluggish. I was hurt by this widespread minimization of my life-threatening situation. What most people don't know is that the surgery to remove a brain tumor is surprisingly quite painless because there are no sensory nerves in the brain. On the other hand, the chest muscles and the skin overlying the breasts are exquisitely sensitive. Also, there's no cosmetic deformity left after the removal of a cancerous brain tissue, except for a gigantic scar across the scalp. I, on the other hand, was left physically disfigured. Still, I couldn't argue with the notion that, in the very least, my breast cancer was curable. No need to worry about dying or anything serious like that. I should be around for several more decades, plenty of time to raise my young family, or so I thought. My absolute rock bottom was the day I received my surgical pathology results. I made the mistake of taking the doctor's shortcut. My breast surgeon, Dr. Borgen, was on vacation for the 2 weeks immediately following my mastectomy. As an informed and impatient surgeon, I knew pathology results only took a week to be finalized. So, expecting no surprises, I begged Natalie, and I explain in the book who she is, but she was one of my best friends from medical school who turned out to eventually become a breast radiologist. And so she was really the first person that I called, and she was kind of the person that was leading me through a lot of it later on. So I called, and she worked at the institution where the breast surgeon worked. Expecting no surprises, I begged Natalie to get the results in advance of Dr. Borgen's return from vacation. This was a mistake. I promised her I'd act appropriately surprised at my follow-up appointment, which was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and she hesitated, but under duress, she complied. She texted me a picture of the 3-page results. Reading it in concert, we were both faced with shockingly grave news, and here are the highlights. 18 out of 24 lymph nodes positive for cancer. Evidence of lymphovascular invasion. Diffuse micrometastasis. These are all very bad features. What happened to the tumor I had supposedly caught early? And what about that single rogue lymph node that had supposedly been completely excised? All these tumor-filled lymph nodes landed me at a stage 3C disease, which is the worst category out of stages A, B, and C. This was a terrible, although not the worst place to be, given that cancer has only 4 stages. It changed the game. Preoperatively, Borgen had promised me only a 50-50 chance of requiring chemo and no chance of requiring radiation. Suddenly, the treatment course stretched out before me like an interminably long road. 14 weeks of chemotherapy was now a definite, followed by 5 to 6 weeks of exhausting radiation. When would I be able to return to work? And more importantly, could this disease kill me? I cried myself to sleep each night, imagining my daughters growing up motherless. When I met my friend Rachel, a well-respected cognitive behavioral psychologist who should have known better, for dinner, I was still reeling from the news. Wait, if you have a 49% chance of disease-free survival, that means you have a 51% chance of dying. Yes, thanks for the math lesson. And this coming from a woman who's professionally trained to alter people's negative perceptions and treat anxiety. Shit, I am screwed. As it turns out, Dr. Borgen had a convenient theory that placed me back in around the 90% cure rate. It took another week for me to hear his optimistic view, during which time I drew up my will. Dr. Borgen's interpretation was worth the wait. He explained that my tumor was relatively innocent, as malignant tumors go. Yet by chance, it happened to be growing near a large lymphatic channel. Think of it as a not particularly aggressive driver who suddenly finds himself on the Autobahn. The average tumor should only be able to drive at a rate of 60 miles per hour, but your tumor just happened to jump on the superhighway going 100 miles per hour. So it was able to spread quickly, spraying little tumor seeds everywhere in the axillary node system. Great, just my luck, and I don't even speed. The point of Borgen's analogy was that he believed that my cancer was still highly curable. It was just going to take a lot more time and effort to get there. In future appointments, my medical oncologist would independently come up with a similar perspective. With both of my oncologic doctors supporting the theory, I decided to buy into the whole positive interpretation of my lousy pathology results. Because at that point, I had nothing to lose. Okay, so here I was, I had to start chemo, and I know there are a lot of really amazing women that work their way through chemo. I couldn't. I was super duper nauseous, and my job is pretty physical because I take care of only children, and they're always trying to get away from me because they don't want me to stick things in their ears and nose and throat. And I just couldn't do it. And if I couldn't do it in the office, like you can't, I didn't think it was right to be operating on children, like not at 100%. So who was I if not this surgeon? That was so much of my identity. And I know that there were other parts, but this was like my defining first thing when someone said, who are you? And it was really, really uncomfortable for me to be on the other side. I mean, as a surgeon, a little bit more so than just a doctor in general, you're really in charge of your OR. Like you walk in, it's a little bit still militaristic in terms of hierarchy. And now I was this vulnerable person kind of, coming into a waiting room and just being, like everybody else. And it was a really uncomfortable place for me. And I had to really try to figure out again, like, if you stripped it all away, what was left? I mean, I had spent, like I said, 11 years working towards this point, and then I had been in practice for 3 years. And so it was a long time before I knew myself, like, not as a doctor, or at least not as a practicing doctor. So some of the things that really helped me get through it, and I think, again, these are all universal themes. You don't have to have a major health crisis, but we've all had some type of crisis in our life. And for me, it was, defining a purpose. So if I wasn't going to get up every single day or most days and go to the OR,